June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The pencil shook slightly as Unteroffizier Vera Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, notes that could have earned him solitary confinement if discovered by his own officers. "The Americans must be deceiving us," he wrote. "No nation can possess such wealth while fighting a war on two fronts." Through the train window, he had just seen something that contradicted 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights illuminated every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation of light stretching across the Texas plains even at 10 p.m. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Even before the war, only about 20% of German farms were electrified. Yet here, in the country Nazi propaganda had described as a decaying America, electricity flowed as freely as water. That day, 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped down from the passenger train. They arrived not in cattle cars or freight wagons but in cushioned Pullman coaches with dining and sleeping accommodations. The entire town of Mahia turned out to witness their arrival, unaware that this moment would mark the beginning of one of the most profound psychological transformations in modern military history, the dismantling of Nazi ideology through the undeniable display of American industrial might. The arithmetic of Allied victory was being written not in strategy rooms, but in production figures that would soon destroy every assumption these men had about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. The collapse had begun on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor, surrendered along with roughly 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian troops. The exact number varied as scattered units continued to lay down arms over several days. These were the Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert soldiers, the men who had driven the British back to Egypt and earned even Montgomery's reluctant respect, now reduced to prisoners. Among them was Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the French campaign, and twice wounded in North Africa. His diary, discovered decades later in the U.S. National Archives, provides historians with one of the most detailed records of how captivity in America reshaped the worldview of German soldiers. Their journey from defeat to revelation began at the port of Oran, Algeria. As Radke and 30,000 other POWs waited in makeshift camps for transport ships, they were already witnessing the efficiency that would challenge everything they had believed. The U.S. Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organization surpassing even the Wehrmacht at its peak. Each man was photographed, issued identification cards, medically examined, vaccinated, and informed, clearly and in fluent German, of his rights under the Geneva Convention by American officers specially trained for this task. But the first real shock came with the food. Oberstfreiter Hans Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later. "In the cage at Oran, while waiting for ships, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert war. White bread, real coffee, meat twice daily. We thought it was propaganda meant to impress us. Only later did we realize these were standard rations." The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic were themselves testaments to American industrial strength. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a feat that, had the Germans known, they would have dismissed as pure fabrication. At the height of production, 3 Liberty ships were launched daily. After delivering supplies to Europe, these ships returned loaded not with cargo but with human passengers, up to 30,000 POWs each month by mid-1943. The 2-week Atlantic crossing that summer marked the second stage of their psychological awakening. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division described it vividly in letters later found after the war. The ship's crew discarded more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. They threw away half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread, gallons of milk. Not to mock us, simply because to them, it meant nothing. Their supply seemed endless. The ships themselves served as lessons in American production power. The prisoners learned that there were 2,710 Liberty ships built during the war, each requiring 250,000 parts produced in 32 states. Their engines were assembled from components built in 3 separate factories, each producing massive 900 horsepower cylinders that were joined in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, descended from an old Prussian military family, later wrote in his memoirs, "As our ship neared the American coast, I watched the radar antenna turning above the bridge. We had believed such technology limited to ourselves or perhaps the British, yet here it was standard on a cargo ship. That was when I first realized Germany had already lost the war." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first sight of America erased any remaining illusions about its supposed industrial weakness. The Norfolk base stretched over 4,300 acres, docks extending for miles, cranes working continuously as dozens of ships were loaded and unloaded at once. In a single day, this one harbor handled more cargo than the entire port of Hamburg did in a week. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr, counted 47 ships in various stages of loading and unloading. Each crane, he noted in his hidden journal, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses back home. And they did so quietly, powered by electricity rather than coal smoke. As the prisoners were marched toward the waiting trains, they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds belonging to dock workers. In Germany, car ownership remained a privilege of the elite. The Volkswagen, promised to ordinary citizens since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 units. Here, every worker seemed to drive one. But nothing surprised them more than the trains. Not boxcars or 40 and 8s, designed for troops and horses, but full passenger trains. Pullman cars with padded seats that turned into berths, dining cars with linen tablecloths, and observation cars with panoramic windows. "We boarded like tourists, not captives," Radke wrote. One guard even apologized for the air conditioning not working properly, something they had believed existed only on Hitler's personal train. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma dismantled Nazi propaganda more effectively than any battle. As the trains rolled through Virginia, the soldiers pressed against the windows, witnessing an America that should not have existed, according to everything they'd been taught. Every small town glowed with electric light. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro, communities that in Germany might have had a single street lamp, were ablaze with illuminated signs and lit homes. Factories operated through the night, their parking lots full even at midnight. Obergefreiter Müller later recalled, "We passed through dozens of towns that first night. Each one had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The guards told us every American town had power since the 1920s. I called him a liar. He only smiled and said we would see." When the train stopped in Roanoke, Virginia for refueling, the prisoners watched American railway workers complete in 30 minutes what took 2 hours in Germany, thanks to automated coal loaders, electric pumps, and mechanized lubrication. Even more unsettling was the workers' casual wealth. Leather boots, Coca-Cola bottles tossed away, cigarettes extinguished half-smoked. Feldwebel Hinrich Mahler, an electrical engineer before the war, estimated that a single rail yard consumed more electricity in 1 hour than his entire Berlin district in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he wrote. "They left lights on in empty rooms, fans running in vacant offices. It was the carelessness of unlimited supply." Crossing into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners saw American industry at full power. Endless factories, larger than any they had ever seen. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched 3 miles along the river, its furnaces drawing 175,000 kilowatts, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, they passed Rubbertown, a complex of synthetic rubber plants built from nothing in just 18 months. 4 vast facilities, each employing thousands, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year. Germany, despite inventing the process, had never exceeded 120,000 tons. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist from IG Farben, later said, "I recognized those distillation columns, those catalytic crackers. Each of these plants was more advanced than anything we had. And there were 4, just here." They said there were dozens more across the country. As the trains neared Detroit, they passed the Willow Run plant, visible for miles, a single factory producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Built in 9 months, employing 42,000 workers, and using over 2.5 million square feet of space, it consumed more electricity than the entire city of Cologne. Hauptmann Verli, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face to the train window as they passed through Michigan. He counted 17 B-24 bombers in various stages of construction. We were told American aircraft were poorly built, rushed into service, and incapable of withstanding combat, he wrote. But from what I saw, the assembly lines were precise, the workmanship was meticulous. These were not inferior machines, they were simply built faster than we believed possible. The deeper the trains moved into America, the more thoroughly Nazi propaganda began to unravel. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River via the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges carried more grain than Germany had harvested in all of 1942. Grain elevators lined both shores, each one capable of storing enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, wrote in his journal, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition, endlessly, without worry of loss. I watched them load a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator ate a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped near an immense stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle awaited slaughter. The air carried the heavy scent of meat-packing plants for miles. German prisoners who had survived on 200 grams of meat per week in North Africa watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their breaks. "They eat meat the way we eat bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They eat meat the way we wished we could eat bread." A guard bought the prisoners hamburgers from a nearby stand, meat, cheese, and vegetables on soft white bread, for 15 cents each. He paid for 20 sandwiches with a single dollar, without hesitation. This was not luxury, Fischer noted. This was ordinary food. Their arrival at the camps marked the next step in their psychological transformation. Camp Hearn, in Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions superior to what many had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and central heating stood row upon row. Each building used more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astonished even the trained medical officers among them. Oberstabsarzt Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals, complete with X-ray machines, modern surgical tools, and pharmaceutical stores that had been unavailable in Germany since 1941. They had penicillin, he later testified, a miracle drug we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for lack of sulfur drugs, and the Americans treated us with their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchens became another lesson in abundance. Prisoners assigned to kitchen duty found walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, industrial dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of feeding 5,000 men at once. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread, quantities unseen in Germany since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, recorded, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years, not spoiled, just surplus." Regulations require 10% extra to ensure every man receives full rations. The rest is discarded. I wept as I threw good bread into the bin. By September 1943, America's labor shortages led to German POWs being employed in farms and factories nationwide. The move, driven by necessity, proved more damaging to Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Prisoners traveled daily through the American countryside without blindfolds or restrictions, seeing everything. Vast fields of corn and wheat, round-the-clock factories, well-stocked stores, parking lots full of cars, and homes with refrigerators and radios. T.A. Cotton Gin near Houston. Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have handled in a month. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The farmer who owned the gin was no nobleman or party official, Lang noted. Just a farmer. Yet he had electricity, running water, a car, a truck, and a tractor. His workers, including the Negroes, ate lunches with more food than German workers saw in a week. And this was normal. Every farm we passed was the same. In Nebraska, prisoners working in sugar beet fields witnessed mechanized agriculture on a scale they could hardly comprehend. One combine harvester could do the work of 100 men. The fields stretched to the horizon, each larger than an entire German district. Farmers casually discussed yields of 60 bushels of wheat per acre, double Germany's best. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, working near Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farmer's son, only 16, drove a tractor worth more than my father earned in his lifetime. When I said so, the boy laughed and said it wasn't even a good model. His father was waiting for a newer one from John Deere." The most shattering realizations came to those who worked in American factories. While the Geneva Convention barred prisoners from direct war production, they were permitted to work in industries supporting it, allowing thousands to witness American industrial might firsthand. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners saw production lines that processed more tomatoes in a day than most German plants did in a month. Despite being staffed mostly by women and older men, since younger workers were serving overseas, output exceeded peacetime levels. Stabsfeldwebel Ernst Wagner, who had worked in a food processing plant before the war, observed, "Everything was automated. Conveyor belts, filling machines, steam cookers, all electrically powered." One elderly woman oversaw controls that replaced 50 German workers. She did this while sipping coffee and listening to the radio. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at a power plant glimpsed the industrial heart of America. The River Rouge complex, visible across the water, employed 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. The plant consumed 1.5 million kilowatts of electricity daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. "We could see thousands of cars in the workers' parking lots," wrote Oberstfreiter Franz Kellner. In Germany, even officers rarely owned cars. Here, laborers drove themselves to work. The guard told us some families owned two. We thought he was joking. By winter 1943, the cumulative effect of these experiences led to what American intelligence called ideological collapse syndrome. The Special Projects Division, part of the Provost Marshal General's office, quietly documented the shift. More prisoners began requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational material. Major Paul Noland, a member of the monitoring team, reported in December 1943. "The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. Even the most devoted Nazis are silent now. They still claim loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory." Prisoner-run newspapers began reflecting this change. Der Ruf, published at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, gradually shifted from nationalist rhetoric to discussions of democracy, economics, and post-war rebuilding. Editors, carefully chosen anti-Nazi inmates, found growing acceptance among their peers. Lieutenant Hermann Gutz, captured with the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a censored letter, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, incapable of fighting. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and capable nation on earth. We were fed fairy tales by criminals." The next and most devastating blow to Nazi ideology came from observing the treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943. Those who agreed to cooperate with the Allies were organized into Italian service units, receiving better housing, higher pay, and greater freedoms. German POWs watched in disbelief as their former allies worked alongside Americans, dined in restaurants, and even dated American women. Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet the Americans treat them with respect. They work freely, earn wages, send packages home. The Americans show them no hatred. This democracy we were told to despise appears more honorable than our own." Christmas 1943 brought the most profound emotional impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs, men who had been their enemies only months before. Each parcel contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and small gifts. Local communities invited prisoners to holiday dinners, though most offers were declined due to regulations. At Camp Hearn, a Methodist church choir performed carols in German. Women from the town sent homemade cookies and cakes. Boy Scouts delivered hand-drawn Christmas cards. The kindness stunned the prisoners. Oberleutnant Walter Meller, whose brother had died in Hamburg's bombing, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have family fighting against us, yet they treat us with Christian compassion, not propaganda, but sincerity. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those utterly certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself was overwhelming. Turkey, ham, potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream, amounts of food unseen in Germany since before the First World War. "We ate like kings," wrote Feldwebel Hans Sauer, "better than generals or party leaders at home. And this was not special," the guard said, "this was a normal American Christmas dinner. If they feed prisoners like this, what must their soldiers eat?" By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in educational programs. They studied English, history, mathematics, and science. Universities like Chicago and Stanford provided courses and lectures, some even on democracy and economics. The hunger for knowledge was immense. Prisoners who had believed Americans were uncultured discovered vast libraries, open universities, and world-leading research institutions. They read American newspapers freely, comparing perspectives, something unimaginable under Nazi rule. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic physics at Camp Shelby. He later wrote, "American professors, including Jewish refugees, taught us without bitterness. They spoke of science as belonging to all humanity. They were years ahead of our research, and shared it with enemies." Such generosity was beyond anything in Nazi thought. Camp theaters screened ordinary Hollywood films, not propaganda, but regular entertainment. Prisoners watched Gone with the Wind and The Grapes of Wrath, astonished by the openness with which Americans portrayed their own flaws. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer reflected, "They hide nothing, their defeats, their poverty, their struggles. Yet their honesty makes them stronger, not weaker. In Germany, such criticism would mean death. Here, it is patriotism." By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded as American production reached its peak. German POWs worked in canneries, mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing firsthand the industrial engine fueling the Allied war. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners unloaded steel that became landing craft for D-Day. They watched 20,000 workers, many of them women, produce 700 boats per month, each requiring 20,000 individual parts. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann recorded simply, "Women worked the cranes, welded the hulls, and managed the lines. It was industry beyond anything we imagined." They saw men and women working side by side, black workers operating advanced machinery, and teenagers managing heavy drills, all tasks they were told democracy could never handle. Yet production never slowed. The factories ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They built more landing craft in a single month than the entire German Navy could build in a year. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed 10,000 tons of steel produced daily. The blast furnaces never stopped, constantly supplied by trains bringing iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania. The scale was unimaginable to them. One plant produced more steel than all of Germany's Ruhr region at its peak. "I worked at Krupp before the war," wrote Oberwachtmeister Paul Hartmann. "I thought I understood industry, but this was beyond belief. They spilled more steel as waste than we could ever produce." Workers complained about overtime while producing amounts we couldn't reach even with forced labor and double shifts. The summer of 1944 brought the final blow to Nazi propaganda about American weakness. German prisoners working across the Midwest saw a level of agricultural production that could feed entire continents. In Kansas, they watched farms harvest more wheat than whole German provinces combined. Massive combines moved through endless golden fields, each harvesting over 100 acres a day. The grain elevators could store more wheat than Germany imported in a year. One American farmer with modern machinery does the work of 100 German farmers, wrote Franz Weber, a farmer from East Prussia. They showed me aerial photos, thousands of square miles of wheat fields. They could lose half their crop and still have more than all of Europe. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards stretching beyond the horizon. They were stunned to see good fruit thrown away for the slightest blemish, fruit that would have been priceless in Germany. Sometimes entire crops were destroyed to stabilize prices. They destroy food to control markets, wrote Gefreiter Otto Schultz. Mountains of oranges buried by bulldozers because they had too many. We begged them to send it to our families, but the guards explained it wasn't possible. The waste itself proved how vast their resources were. When news of the D-Day invasion reached the camps on June 6, 1944, the psychological collapse was complete. The scale: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave, demonstrated an organizational might Germany could never match. At Camp Shelby, prisoners watched newsreels showing the invasion, endless convoys of ships, artificial harbors, and supply lines delivering 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They realized then that Nazi Germany's defeat was inevitable. We knew everything was lost, wrote Friedrich von Tauben. Not only the war, but the entire Nazi vision. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with myths and arrogance. Yet what changed the prisoners most was not America's strength, but its compassion. Despite Nazi claims that Americans were weak and sentimental, POWs discovered a people confident enough in their power to show mercy. When Hans Mahler received word his son had died in Hamburg, the camp commander personally delivered the message and offered condolences. When Paul Fischer's wife wrote that she couldn't feed their children, American church groups sent food packages to enemy civilians in a country still at war. They said they fought Hitler, not the German people, wrote Otto Heldmann. We thought it was propaganda, but it was true. They were preparing us to rebuild Germany, not destroy it. Medical care left an equally deep impression. German doctors worked with American staff, learning modern surgical methods and psychiatric care that didn't exist in the Wehrmacht. Prisoners received operations unavailable even to German officers. They treated suicide attempts with counseling, not punishment, wrote Dr. Friedrich Bauer. Those with mental breakdowns got therapy, not beatings. This kindness toward enemies revealed a strength we never understood, the confidence of true power. By March 1945, the secret re-education program had exceeded all expectations. Over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Camp newspapers printed essays about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Former officers who once swore loyalty to Hitler were now planning how to rebuild a democratic Germany. We became missionaries for democracy, admitted Horst Hermann Göring, no relation to the Reich Marshal, in 1975. Not because of propaganda, but because we saw it work. Ordinary people lived better than German nobility. We wanted that for Germany. The transformation was so profound that U.S. officials began to worry about prisoners becoming too pro-American. Some asked to remain in the U.S. after the war. Others married American women they met through pen pal programs. Thousands later immigrated in the 1950s. Then came the final shock. In April 1945, when the Allies liberated Nazi concentration camps, American forces showed the footage to German POWs. At first, many refused to believe it, claiming it was faked. But the evidence, film, eyewitness accounts, letters from home, was undeniable. The impact was devastating. We thought we were fighting for a great cause, wrote Walter Schmidt. We discovered we were tools of criminals. The Americans we mocked as weak showed us what civilization truly meant. By May 1945, as the war ended, the prisoners faced repatriation with mixed feelings. They had seen an America that contradicted everything they were taught. They had been treated with more humanity by their captors than by their own regime. Before returning home, they received training in farming, trades, and governance. They learned about the Marshall Plan before it was public. They prepared us to rebuild, wrote von Tauben. They gave us hope. Their generosity was beyond anything our leaders ever imagined. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,000 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a ruined homeland but carried priceless knowledge, how a democratic, industrial society functioned. Many became key figures in West Germany's reconstruction: ambassadors, agricultural reformers, and industrial planners. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on what they had seen in captivity. We learned prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, wrote Hans Kroll. Democracy creates wealth, diversity creates strength, and treating workers well builds productivity. Historians call it one of the most successful re-education efforts in history, achieved not through coercion, but by letting prisoners witness the truth. America didn't defeat Nazism through propaganda, but through proof: full meals, electric light, working toilets, small details that shattered myths of superiority. Of the 371,683 POWs held in the U.S., fewer than 1% ever tried to escape, and none succeeded permanently. 95% described their treatment as good or excellent. Decades later, thousands still wrote letters to the American families they'd met. In 1985, hundreds returned for a reunion in Texas, former enemies now friends. One former prisoner, Hans Vea, told the audience, "Life in the camps was better than at home. But more than comfort, we found dignity." Another, Kurt Meyer, added, "The farmers treated us like young men, not enemies. Their kindness changed us forever." At the closing dinner, 78-year-old Hermann Gutz spoke the words that summed up their transformation. "We came as Nazis and left as Democrats. America showed us that strength comes from creation, not conquest, from freedom, not tyranny." The hall erupted in applause as former foes stood together, united by what they had learned. The story of German POWs in America is one of redemption through revelation. The U.S. won not just the war, but the peace, by demonstrating that a free society's greatest weapon is not its armies, but its humanity. The men who once fought for the Third Reich returned home not as conquerors, but as witnesses to what freedom could build. And in that transformation lay the foundation of a new world.